this tendency in the Western Philosophical Academy to ignore mysticism, again, not just in Maimonides, but in all of ancient and medieval philosophy, when really the two were, I think, inextricably linked. What is the actual experience being described here? In some sense, I wish he'd, sort of come out and describe his journey directly, and, we wouldn't have to speculate and, piece together the puzzle. But like, I think that's part of the beauty of the guy, is he wanted to guide us along his journey. He didn't just want to come out and tell us what he believes. Right? I think the more I delve into Maimonides, like from Moses to Moses, none arose like Moses, I think it's true. I know, like, people say it's a hyperbole, but like, he really did, I think, reveal truths about spirituality, the nature of God, in ways that really no one since Moses did, and no one since him has really done either. And I think that's why so much of post-Maimonidean Jewish theology is just trying to uncover the meaning of Maimonides, because it really was just such a profound work.
Hey.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, now I hear you.
Excellent.
Woo! Okay. We'll do it without earphones. How are you?
Good, thank God. How are you?
Good, doing well, thank God. Thanks for joining me here.
No problem.
I don't know much about you.
No, nor I you. So
good.
We should get to know each other.
Yes. Wait, so tell me a bit about you, and then I'll tell you about myself.
I guess my background, I'm a high school genetics teacher.
Nice.
My interest in Maimonides started very young, going back to, I had a high school teacher who introduced me to the Guide to the Perplexed. But early on, it was sort of very purely philosophical. Mm-hmm. Just like, what does, the intellectual system, what does he believe? And, I'd say when I was younger, I had like zero interest in mysticism at all. Sort of very much in the, Enlightenment mindset of, mysticism is just sort of this fuzzy, subjective thing, can't be verified, can't be explained. And I guess just my thinking on Maimonides changed over the years, from a couple of different angles. One, a teacher of mine at one point introduced me to the concept of intellectual mysticism, and like just the notion that mysticism and rationalism didn't need to be at odds with each other, and also sort of the difference between mysticism and an enchanted universe, which tend to get conflated so often.
Yep.
And I started seeing things in Maimonides that sounded kind of mystical, like his theory of knowledge, and the union of the knower and the known. Is like, well, that sounds kind of like Unia Mystica if you think about it. And so that was one angle. And then the other angle that got me interested in it was from a totally different side, having nothing to do with Maimonides at first, which was I read Andrew Newberg's work on the neuroscience of mysticism, which sort of led me down a path of reading Aldous Huxley and William James on mysticism. And as I started reading about mysticism, not as a specific movement, but sort of as this global religious psychological phenomenon, I just started seeing a lot of echoes of Maimonides in there. It's like, someone needs to synthesize these two.
And how did you go about synthesizing them?
It's a work in progress. It's not, can't say that I have produced the grand synthesis yet, but I think in general, the realization, and I think, sort of when I first went about it, it was sort of that, that Aristotelian, unity of the knower of the known. But then as I thought about it more, really the negative theology, like negative theology always goes together with mysticism. Once you get to the notion that you can't have any, direct knowledge of God, well, that, I've tried to remember, this is not my original line, I don't remember who said this, that I read this, but that always takes you in one of two directions. Either it can take you to radical agnosticism of, well, I don't know, if I don't know anything about God, I can't really know God's existence either, which I guess ultimately is the direction that Maimonides thinks Maimonides went in. Or it could take you to apophatic mysticism, where I can't know God, I can only directly experience God.
Right. Franz Rosenzweig has that line in The Star of Redemption that apophatic theology or negative theology is where mysticism and atheism shake hands.
Is that Rosenzweig? Okay, that must be where I saw it.
So you grew up in a non-mystical world. You're introduced to the guide in a non-mystical context. You begin reading it, you begin to see some themes of mysticism, and then through another direction, you get introduced to mysticism, and then you begin to see more and more Maimonides there, and you begin to put together your thoughts, your notes, and you write a really brilliant article for Lair House on Maimonides and mysticism, which I think is probably where I began doing my research, was actually with your thoughts, and I think you really mapped out some of the good directions to that and pointed me to the scholarship, whether that be Blumenthal or Freudenthal. And I'm curious, so I'm getting a sense of your journey, your trajectory here. Where do things continue from there? Because I don't get to see what happens past that point.
Right. So that article was really like my first foray into the topic, and really just sort of, like you said, relying primarily on Blumenthal and Freudenthal, not so much my own work, and Blumenthal obviously did a lot of work on looking for like specific linguistic parallels between Maimonides and Sufism, and on some level, like I think he does a lot of good work there, and it's not so much my interest. I'm not so much interested in exactly where did the Rambam get this from, as sort of, I'm much more interested in the phenomenology of religion than the history of religion. What is the actual experience being described here? And so I guess where sort of my thought has developed since then is really trying to understand mysticism just as a general phenomenon, and seeing where I see that, and also focusing much more on the negative theology, because neither Blumenthal, a little bit more than Freudenthal, but neither one of them focused that much on the negative theology. And really that sense that if you think about what the Rambam is describing in part 3, chapter 51 of the guide, it is your typical apophatic mystical meditation of remove everything from your thoughts, and God is what you experience when you clear everything else from your mind. And I think it's interesting, and some scholars have written about this again from a philosophical perspective, the shift in Maimonides' thinkings from his earlier works to the guide. And I think the shift is very clearly a shift away from Aristotelianism. And if you look at the Mishnah Torah, he never really has the kind of radical theology in Mishnah Torah, radical negative theology in Mishnah Torah, that he does in the guide. So seeing that sort of development in his thought.
That's okay. That's really interesting. There's a whole lot of like themes that you're bringing up that I want to ask you about. I'm just notes here to keep track of this. Before we launch into a heavier conversation, this has got a very light start here. When you say mysticism, can you give me a working definition for what that term means for you?
Mysticism for me is the attempt to experience directly God or some ultimate reality, since obviously not every mystical system uses the word God.
Right. So to have a direct, unmediated experience of God or ultimate reality.
Right. And usually brought on through meditation, though obviously there are some testimonies of people having spontaneous mystical experiences, but not that common.
So that would include something like the techniques or practices of mysticism that bring to that experience.
Yeah.
Okay, so a few things here that I want to ask about. One is, firstly, this insistence on negative theology or negative theology as being the focus of your interest now, as opposed to a mysticism found in Maimonides through his theory of knowledge or some other ways to get there. There's metaphysics of getting there, his cosmology and other like Neoplatonic directions, but specifically the negative theology direction. So I'm curious, because negative theology is not unique to mystics. Firstly, there are theologians throughout history who are negative theologians without being mystics, and you have mystics who aren't negative theologians, who are cataphatic, like in their theology. So
yes.
Yeah, what do you make of that?
I mean, I think you'd be hard pressed to find a negative theologian without mystical inclinations.
Would you say that Aquinas is a negative theologian without mysticism?
I'm not convinced of either of those statements about Aquinas, either that he is a negative theologian or that he is. I mean, Aquinas. So I'm not that familiar with Aquinas, so bracketing everything I say here, but I do believe Aquinas sometimes shades into mysticism. I read at some point like a critique of Bertrand Russell's critique of Aquinas that critiquing Bertrand Russell for ignoring mysticism as a factor in Aquinas's thought. Again, I'm not that familiar with either Aquinas or Russell, so I can't really evaluate that scholarship myself. And I don't think I think Aquinas, if I recall correctly, has a critique of negative theology. I think he has this thing where you can't really have any real negative theology, because if you describe God as ineffable, ineffable is a description. Right.
Okay, let's come back to that question. I'm curious. This is something which I saw in a later essay that you published for Lehrhaus, that Maimonides drifts away from his commitment to Aristotelianism. Who are the scholars that you're following in that direction? Is that something that you've that your own direction of thought?
What's names at the tip of my tongue.
I know that Ivry makes the case that Maimonides drifts away from his Aristotelianism.
I mean, Pines makes it also.
Ivry has this very cute reading of Maimonides' letter to his translator, Ibn Tibbon, and he says that the reason why Maimonides actually persuades Ibn Tibbon not to visit is because Maimonides was going through his own crisis of faith, which was his faith in Aristotelianism, and he sensed that Ibn Tibbon was sensing that, and he didn't want Ibn Tibbon to come and put it to him directly, which is why he pushes him away, which is such a funny reading, because we typically think of a crisis of faith as being like a faith with religion, not with like your favorite philosophy.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if that's for sure. I mean, it's interesting in the letter to Ibn Tibbon, he still has all his praises for Aristotle, but I think it's key, I think, that even with all his praises for Aristotle, is that Aristotle, had the greatest human achievements, except the level of the prophets. And I think that's not a throwaway line. I think he wants to hint at to you there that there is a level beyond Aristotle. Don't forget about the prophets. And I think the prophets, and I think prophecy is such a huge theme in his writings that when he says that, I don't think he means the words of the Bible. I think he means the pursuit of prophecy for the individual.
So you think he's including like non-biblical prophets in that line of placing people above Aristotle, potentially?
I don't think he means he's referring to specific non-biblical prophets, but I think I think it's very clear, and I guess I follow Heschel in this. Well, I'm not 100% sure that Heschel is right that Maimonides believed he had actually achieved prophecy, but that he for sure was trying to. He for sure saw achieving prophecy as a goal of his religious quest, and I think it's key that he believed, let's say, contra Al-Farabi and Avicenna, that prophecy could grant real knowledge that was philosophically indeterminate. That, and I think that's sort of all of the chapters on creation in the guide, I think, are pushing in that direction.
Yeah, I read your case against or for Maimonides' abandonment of Aristotelianism. It seemed to me, and I haven't read so much into the subject on that area as you have, but it seems to me like we can kind of read the passages in the guide which may be non-Aristotelian, like either way. If we wanted to bring some sort of like generous hermeneutic, we could still be reading them as Aristotelian. Is there some other motivation or some other more like explicit reason why we would want to read those as an abandonment of Aristotelianism? Because they didn't seem terribly persuasive in and of themselves.
Okay. Yeah. So let me get to that. Sorry. The scholar I was thinking of before is Charles Manikin.
Okay.
He's a scholar at the University of Maryland, and he's done a lot of research looking at changes in Maimonides' thoughts and the way I don't necessarily agree with all of his conclusions, but he portrays it as greater theological conservatism in Maimonides' later writings. And of course, the other one, as I just briefly referenced earlier, is Shlomo Pinus, who thinks that Maimonides moved away from Aristotelianism towards, he thinks towards agnosticism. But but also documenting the constant, every time he references the separate intelligences in the guide, it's always with a measure of skepticism. What's motivating it for me? I mean, let's say there's the reason that I hope it's not, but is always a factor with all Maimonides scholars, because everyone always sees themselves in Maimonides. Is I hope it's not me just looking for my own spiritual development within Maimonides, though one has to be honest and acknowledge that as a possible factor. And the other factor, I think the major factor for me was just sort of when I finally read the guide cover to cover. It took me a long time to actually do that. I had read probably most of the guide, but just like looking up what does he say here and there about different things and using it as a philosophical text as opposed to using it the way he says to read it, which is beginning to end. And first of all, the realization that there just are a lot of things in the guide that feel very differently from what he says in his earlier writings, and sort of the other way to read it, and this is acknowledged by the like Straussian school, that tension is acknowledged, except they think that basically the non-Aristotelian things in the guide are a smokescreen, and he puts them in to give him theological cover, and what he really believes is the Aristotelian thing. I think what's his name, Warren Zev Harvey has this article where he says, well, the Mishnah Torah is the secret to understanding the secrets of the guide. And to me, I just don't get it. The secret views of the guide are the ones that he already said explicitly in Mishnah Torah. Right? I think if anything, it's pushing in the opposite direction, and he's using the Aristotelian stuff in the guide as the smokescreen to sort of distract the reader from the fact that he's pushing away from Aristotelianism.
And what is it that he's pushing towards? You would say to some form of mysticism?
On a philosophical level, it's the tension between, as you discussed in one of your episodes, between, the Aristotelian God of the self-knowing intellect and the Neoplatonist, one which is beyond all intellect beyond all being. On a philosophical level, it's it's sort of Neoplatonism, and I think the only thing he really likes from Neoplatonism is the negative theology. He very much doesn't like the hypostases of Neoplatonism, but so pushing, at least in terms of how you think about God, in the direction of negative theology, in that Neoplatonist direction, and yeah. So I mean, I think it's pointing in a more mystical direction, but not not to say that the Mishneh Torah wasn't mystical. I think Moshe Idel describes, like, in the Middle Ages, you have, I think he said, 3 different schools of mysticism, but the 2 that I would focus on here are the Aristotelian school and the Neoplatonist school. And in the Aristotelian school, basically the object that you're seeking mystical union with is the active intellect, and it's it's an intellectual process. We see that kind of in Abulafia. Not to say that his interpretations of Maimonides were accurate, but he certainly is building off of Maimonidean ideas, and and I think you see that in the Mishneh Torah. I think when he talks about the the identity of the knower of the known, he talks about meditating on these things, and he talks about the love of God. I think there is a mystical tendency there also, but I think it's really at some point he comes to the realization that there's something beyond that
Right.
as I think Diana Lobel put it, God as intellect is also an attribute of action. Right? You can't even say that about God.
Yes, certainly. She sees it as like a major contradiction running through the guide. It's interesting to try and grapple. I mean, it's like a good chunk of time to work through Maimonides' system just at face value, just to get a good grip on it, and then to begin to like feel into his contradictions, which he says are there, and try feel like, because there is a tension in his work. His work is incredibly systematic and cohesive and coherent, besides for these fault lines, and those fault lines are consistently there, and they, as you begin to pull them, the question is, what does it give way to? And there seems to me like the direction that you're pointing, where there is this kind of bitheism. There's like this God of Aristotle who's like the prime mover, the knowing knower, whatever it is, the self-knowing knower, and then there seems to be this God that he's reaching to beyond, and he feels like, and that feels very uncomfortable, like, and that's where a lot of scholarship is pointed to. And the question is, what does that move mean for him, right? What does that, is that a move to agnosticism, to atheism, to mysticism, to like, where is he going with that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's true. And again, like when you read the guide cover to cover, you sense the contradictions in a way you don't when you read it piecemeal. It's like it can be one chapter to the next, and like you see them right side by side. And I think pretty much all of the contradictions are between Aristotelian ideas and non-Aristotelian ideas. In particular, and I think much of the guide is pushing against, it was Kramer who pointed out that, a lot of times, even though Avicenna is never quoted in the guide, what the Rambam refers to as Aristotelian ideas are actually Avicennan ideas. And I think a lot of the guide is, in very subtle ways, pushing against the notion, Avicenna's notion of a necessary divine will. And again, and I think part of that is it goes together with the negative theology of the realization that if I can say nothing about God, I can't say necessary either. That's also a predicate about God.
Right. And that also seems to be central to like the hot topic, which is like his issue of creationism versus like an eternal universe, where the question here is one of will and one of agency in the divine. I'm curious, just some random things. Have you, firstly, like your knowledge across the scholarship, besides for the primary sources, obviously is really cool. So like that's awesome to see. do you have people that you get to talk to like about Maimonidean scholarship with, or is this all just in your head?
Not as much as I'd like, which is why I was excited about this opportunity.
Nice.
Yeah, I mean, there's like there are, you know, every now and then I'll post something in a Facebook group or something and start a conversation on one of these topics, but it's yeah, it's not that many people, you know, sort of just sadly, you know, sort of living in a traditional Orthodox community, you know, where it's not, you know, and even though I totally consider this traditional Orthodox theology, but people just aren't that interested in theology these days.
Right. I think we're starting to see a bit of a return to theology. There's, you know, a bunch of podcasts out there that are doing theology now, which is fun. I'm curious what your thoughts are, and if you've spent time with Hakham Faur's work, Homo Mysticus.
I have read Hakham Faur's work. Big fan of it in general. I think he does a lot of good work in shifting how people think about the guide, and even though like a lot of people still disagree with his work, but he's one of those works that even if you disagree with, you have to contend with.
Yeah.
You know, I guess one disappointment with the work is that he doesn't put it in conversation with sort of general scholars of mysticism.
Right.
And two is, I think he's writing esoterically also. I think he's writing in a way where he's trying to hide his secrets to the initiates.
And what's his secret?
I'm not sure. I'm not a initiate of Faur, but it seems like he doesn't want to come out and say his biggest chidushim explicitly. He wants to like point you in the direction.
Right.
You know what he is doing in his work what he thinks Maimonides is doing in his.
Right. He's copying him in form and subject. Because he does seem to be pushing for a prophetic reading of Maimonides, and the guide is an initiatory prophetic text that's like striving for a reconstruction of the lost esoteric, might be it like Meister Merkava or prophetic tradition of Judaism. There's I mean, on a point that you said earlier, it seems like Maimonides is taking both from Neoplatonism, both their negative theology, but also their emanationism, and he seems to quite skillfully weed their emanationism into his Ptolemaic Aristotelian cosmology. No, I'm getting you're shaking your head.
Yes and no. I mean, yes, but Al-Farabi already did that.
Sure, yeah. I mean, in many ways, Al-Farabi is, I think, the second most quoted person in the guide, so he's following him.
Right. So I mean, I think in the sense that he's taking the emanationism, he's taking it from Al-Farabi. He's not taking it directly from Neoplatonism, as opposed to.
Oh, I hear what you're saying.
Right, as opposed to the negative theology, which, to the best of my knowledge, and I have certainly not read all of Al-Farabi, but in like the key works of Al-Farabi, does not really appear.
Interesting. I'll have to have a think of that. Sarah Pesson has a brilliant article. I'm sure you've seen it. And she really charts out really lucidly the philosophical antecedents of Maimonides along.
This is her article on the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy.
Yeah. So that's where I would look to see what's happening in Al-Farabi in relation to the theology of Aristotle.
Yeah, that article has been immensely useful in pointing me to the right sources in Al-Farabi.
I actually reached out to interview her as well, to chat with her. She was busy, but like we may actually do that still. And I also spoke to, before starting this series, I spoke to Professor Loberbaum. I think his first name is Yair.
Yeah, he's
directions as well.
Yeah, Loberbaum, from what I've read, like seems like I'd like with him, although his Hebrew is immensely difficult. Academic modern Hebrew is so hard to read.
No, he seemed pretty balanced. I'm curious.
Right.
Yeah.
Pessin does amazing work. Pessin reads Maimonides as an Avicennan.
Yeah, and
So I don't come to the same conclusion she does,
yeah.
but her work has been tremendously useful.
Surprisingly, she also reads him as a non-mystic, and she's reading all of his like mystical constructs as simply philosophical. Like she's assumed them kind of in the Andalusian tradition, which she's identifying as non-mystical, and therefore like all of these what seem to be very mystical propositions for her are just like, oh, this is like just a philosophical proposition, which I would like to ask her about.
It's also, I mean, it's also not clear to me that Avicenna and Ibn Bajjah weren't mystics.
Right, exactly.
And I think there's just this tendency in the Western Philosophical Academy to ignore mysticism, again, not just in Maimonides, but in all of ancient and medieval philosophy, when really the two just, the two were, I think, inextricably linked.
Yeah. There are, I forget which historian does this, but there are ways of looking at like the history of philosophy as just inseparable from the history of mysticism, and whether that's like the pre-Socratics with Parmenides and like just there's this very, very rich mystical stream running straight in many ways from the Greco-Roman mysteries, which then infiltrates pre-Socratic thought and continues forward through Neoplatonism to the rest of the traditions.
Yeah.
I'm
like not mysticism per se, but like in terms of thinking about ancient philosophy, Pierre Hadot's work,
right.
Philosophy as a way of life, and philosophy, again, prior to the modern academy, being rich with things that what we would call today spiritual exercises.
Right.
And even if it wasn't all mystical, like he points out, like each philosophical school has at least someone within that school who has like a mystical component too, because these spiritual exercises, whether initially intended or not, can lead one towards mystical experiences, and then those get worked into the philosophical system.
Yeah. And I mean, if someone's postulating like a monistic metaphysic, and they have practices that are bringing one to experience that, and they're experiencing it, it seems hard to see why that's not rightfully considered mystical. But I guess there's like becomes like a space for like equivocation of language, where a person just may not be defining it or defining those characters in the same way. I'm curious. I have more Maimonides questions, and I'm actually still in the middle of my series, and I'm still continuing to research and write for the last few pieces. I'm thinking of maybe making it like a complete set of 14 pieces because of that number and what it means to Maimonides.
I wish I knew why Maimonides loved the number 14 so much.
So I've heard that it may be because of his brother David. That's the gematria there.
Oh, that's clever.
I don't know. Right.
As good a theory as any I've heard.
Right. That's the one that's stuck with me. But it's I mean, it's a very persistent number, like well before Mishnah Torah even, obviously. His Melissa Going, I think, is 14 chapters as well, which is like one of his earlier pieces. I'm curious. This is like just a personal opportunity to get like critical feedback or whatever it is. I'm curious what, like, I didn't realize that you were watching the videos or following the series. If you have, I'm curious to know what your thoughts have been. What's like positive or critical. I'd love to hear.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly have not listened to all of them yet. Just sort of just listened to a few of them, got started. And I've only listened to the ones on Maimonides, so I haven't followed the series from the beginning, so I couldn't tell you that. But yeah, I mean, so far I really like your treatment of Maimonides. Again, sort of within this, within sort of a religious framework of someone who's not, just looking sort of at, dispassionately, but at the same time engaging with the academic scholarship and taking the phenomenology of Maimonides' religious experiences seriously, which is really my interest. And there's not a lot of scholars engaging that angle. I'd love to know more about your background and how you came to this.
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to tell you. Is that before I tell you that, were there any like glaring mistakes that I should know of, or
Um,
that you would disagree with?
I mean, I wouldn't say mistakes because obviously, like, Maimonides is written in such a way that like there's so many different legitimate interpretations of
Yeah.
it. Um, the thing I thought most interesting is, which I guess I'm going to disagree with in the end, is, but it was interesting that you brought it up, is your discussion of Maimonides as a pantheist or
I knew you would say
panentheist.
that. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's a really interesting argument, and it's a really old argument too. I think Eckhart already makes that argument for in Maimonides, and like it follows, right? If God is if God and God's knowledge are one, and God knows the world, then it seems to follow, quite clearly that God must be identical with the world.
Or at
And
least with the world.
right, yeah, not identical with, because God, panentheism rather than pantheism. But and again, I think Eckhart makes that argument, and nobody takes it seriously. And I think largely because he is also emphatic that God is separate from the world. And
Right.
so, well, how could that be? And you have Spinoza engages this argument, and Spinoza just said, this is part of his, Maimonides was making philosophy into the handmaiden of theology, and he should have acknowledged the consequence, the logical consequence of his description is pantheism, but he refused to acknowledge that consequence because he was too beholden to traditional theology. But it seems to be a good argument, and I think you could go in a few different directions with it. One is sort of the Straussian direction of deny the second premise. Deny that Maimonides actually believes God knows about the world, and then you solve that problem. And then then that really is Aristotle's God. Aristotle's God did not know about the world. I don't think that's accurate, because even though sort of modern scholars of Aristotle describe that as Aristotle's God, that doesn't seem to be how Maimonides himself ever portrays Aristotle. And Maimonides portrays Aristotle's view as sort of in line with Avicenna of God knows the general rules by which the world is governed, and maybe not the particulars. And I think that's sort of the other way you can resolve this conflict, which I saw in totally different contexts, Moshe Idel and Lawrence Kaplan resolving it in this direction, which is to say that Maimonides believes that God doesn't, and I think you mentioned in this possibility, God doesn't know the actual world. God knows all of the universals from which the particulars of the world derive. And to use Avicenna's phrase, God knows particulars in a universal way.
Right.
So God, and I think that idea ultimately just derives from Themistius's commentary on Aristotle. And I have not read Themistius, but I think Idel and Kaplan both say that this derives from Themistius originally, the idea that God knows the forms of all things, which for Aristotle, that was the active intellect, but sort of combining the idea of the active intellect into the idea of God. And God knows the forms of all things, and from that, and from that, sort of because the particulars derive from the form, so you can say God knows particulars away, but God doesn't really know this world per se. God just knows the forms from which everything in this world derives. And I think that's the other way you can resolve that contradiction. And I think that's likely what he meant in Mishneh Torah, something along those lines. Again, ultimately, I think by the time we get to the guide and sort of the robust negative theology, I think the real reason why I would reject the notion of Maimonides as a pantheist or panentheist is because ultimately I think he rejects the Aristotelian notion of God altogether as the self-knowing intellect, and therefore, so if you reject the first premise, then that argument falls through as well.
Right. So I have been thinking this, that like what similarly to what we were saying earlier, that there are these two gods at play in Maimonides' thought. There's God as there's the Aristotelian self-knowing intellect, and then there's, the Neoplatonic God, which is beyond being, or whatever it is, the God of negative theology. Might it be the case that, and this might resolve where we see Maimonides identifying the world with God or God's thought, and therefore God, and where we see Maimonides saying that there's just no comparison at all to be made, and he makes that clear a few times. He has a metaphor of the captain of the ship and other places, right? Could it just be that in one case, when he's talking about the identifiability between God and world, that he's talking about the Aristotelian God, the God that is intellect and does intellectualize something of the world, and whatever that is exactly is up for discussion, and then the God that is just totally beyond, that has no identification with the world at all, that is just entirely sui generis, is the Neoplatonic God, ironically, right? So it's the argument that that Maimonides' pantheism is actually not where his mysticism lies, but his God, which is more mystical, is actually beyond his pantheism. It's specifically his Aristotelian God, which is the quote unquote pan or panentheistic God.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'd largely agree with that, except, sort of ultimately, I think he ultimately agrees with that latter conception, although sort of, it is likely he had the former conception at the time that he wrote the Mishneh Torah. But again, I'm not convinced that it is actually, a pantheism that extends even to the material of the world, as opposed to just the form.
Right. Yeah. So that's something which I brought up in the video there, and Blumenthal kind of makes what's not, I mean, kind of a weak argument that just like that limitation wouldn't apply to it doesn't seem to be that.
Right. I mean, it's ironic. I feel like if you go that route, which I think is likely what he believed. I mean, it's certainly what Avicenna believed. You almost wind up with sort of this Gnostic type worldview where you have the material world, and you have, in some sense, like a spiritual world that exactly mirrors what goes on in the material world, and God knows that spiritual world, and
right.
by extension,
right.
Also. And I don't know if Maimonides would want to be portrayed in that fashion, but it ultimately seems very similar to my mind.
Right. Yeah. I mean, insofar as he's absorbing a lot of like Platonism, right? It's not just a Gnostic notion; it's a Platonic notion, essentially, that there is that dual reality. It's the basic theory of the forms in play there. I think when it comes to these issues, I try not. I mean, obviously, there's a lot of decisions and a lot of like preferences that I'm making when I put the material together and when I'm researching, but I do try and leave it open for the audience, and I'd be like, well, here's this scholar, here's that scholar, and like you can make with that what you want. And even in the end, like I actually don't think that I'm going to present like a conclusion Maimonides was a mystic. I'm being like, this is the reasons why we might believe so, and these are the reasons against it. I think this comes back to that same space between the two gods, which is Adam Offerman's argument against Maimonides as a mystic in his great book, And They Shall Be One Flesh. He has a couple like peripheral arguments, which is like Maimonides isn't really advocating for this, and it's not really his mission, and this. But it seems like his core philosophical argument is that the union that happens, right, even in Guide 351, which he says is only a postmodern union, and there Blumenthal tries to make a reading that it's not just postmodern, but either way is only ever with the active intellect at best. And the active intellect isn't God, even though Maimonides calls it divine. He calls it, right.
I mean, I think part of this is semantic. Like Edel is willing to call those who were seeking union with the active intellect mystics, and Afterman isn't. It becomes a definitional question.
Right. So there is an element of semantics there, but I think there's maybe like a more philosophical question here, which is like, does Maimonides believe that the human mind ultimately can unite with God? And I mean, there's a lot of scholarship on the limits of the human mind. Penis has done this work, and Altman has done it. I think it's been done quite extensively. But does Maimonides, so let's say the Aristotelian God, right? So we have this first God. God is the self-cognizing cognition. It seems that there is a potential link, and that would be God is expressed through the active intellect, insofar as it comes to us, right? That there is a potential for the human mind to relate to that, because that is the image of God through which the human is created, and that is the link, the intellect which links you to God. This is 351. So that God seems to be. This is again the irony. It's the Aristotelian God specifically where Unio Mystica, with whom Unio Mystica seems to be possible.
Right. That's the difference between Blumenthal scholarship and Freudenthal scholarship. Is I think Blumenthal is really focusing on the Unio Mystica, focusing on the Aristotelian language there, whereas Blumenthal is talking about something that goes beyond a pure intellectual mysticism, the supra-rational, he doesn't, I mean, again, he's working on Sufi language, not so much Neoplatonist language, but the idea that it's not just this intellectual union with the active intellect, it's something that goes beyond that. But again, I think it's semantic here, right? I think Afterman doesn't want to call that mystical because unless it's full union, Afterman doesn't want to call that mystical. But I think sort of direct communion, direct experience of unmediated, to use your term before, experience of the divine. I think that's also a mystical experience. I don't think it has to necessarily be a one of union.
Yeah. Although funnily enough, he's actually the one who puts forth the argument that in Maimonides' angelification there is actually like a transformation of the individual into a noetic.
But he may be. So if we're looking on the Aristotelian side, I think he's right. There's union with the active intellect, and that's not post-mortem. I think when he's functioning as an Aristotelian, that's how he describes all prophecy.
Yes.
With active intellect.
Yes.
When he's moving beyond the Aristotelian, there may be a full union that takes place post-mortem. But yeah, it's not clear to me that what he's describing, at least when he moves past the Aristotelian, is full union. But again, it just becomes semantic. Like, are you willing to call that a mystical experience or not? And I guess I am, and Afterman's not. Blumenthal is.
So I'm curious. This is the point that's curious to me, which I'm still trying to clarify for myself, which is why it's still interesting, which is that the God which is beyond the Aristotelian God, right? The God which just has no relationship with the world at all. It seems so, and that God which Afterman is saying that the human does not unite with, right? Which is like well beyond the active intellect. That God which is the God of the negative theology, where you're looking for Maimonides, like mysticism phenomenologically, let's say. It's that God which precisely seems to be beyond the boundaries of Unio Mystica or pantheism or anything that would fall into the categories of mysticism, besides for a negative theology. So it seems like that God, in some sense, I wouldn't call it a theism, but it seems to be, because it's beyond the reaches of the human mind and it's beyond the reaches of any identification with reality, it seems to be in some ways non-mystical. I'm still trying to make sense of that, because it's counterintuitive, right? You would think you're moving from the Aristotelian to the mystical, but we're actually moving into the Neoplatonic and away from the mystical in some sense.
I think it is mystical. I think it is, again, it's semantic. Like, are you willing to call it mystical if it's not full union? But I think there, again, in nearly all negative theology, unless it leads you towards agnosticism, there is this notion of you can't know God, but you can experience God. Clear, and I think that's where Faur's work is useful. About the role of imagination is to experience God, you have to clear your mind of all conceptions of God, because those are all coming ultimately from the imagination, including the Aristotelian one.
Yeah.
Right. All concepts ultimately come from the imagination, and I think that's Faur's big contribution there. It's not different from the way we typically think of imagination. And when you clear your mind of all of those through the various meditative exercises, then you can experience God directly. And it may not be a union but it's a direct unmediated experience.
Okay, so here's my question. So when Maimonides is speaking about experiencing God, let's say in 351, right?
Yeah.
And he has all of his terminology there, ishq and cheshech and noyam and whatever it is.
Yeah.
Is he talking there about the God of Aristotle, or is he talking about the God beyond that?
I think beyond that. I think 351
So
is
why then is he still, his language there is still precisely about the intellect and the intellect's union with that and the necessity to meditate upon that? Like it seems to be the Aristotelian union mystica with the active intellect. No?
Yeah, you're right. He continuously, for all that he pushes away from it, he continuously throws in this Aristotelian smokescreen. and I guess that I'm in a sense reading the guide as an esotericist would, just sort of in the opposite direction from the typical esotericist. Is the Aristotelian stuff is sort of just like covering his bases with the philosophers and hiding his departure from them.
So I mean, interesting. I think we always have to be like dubious and skeptical of esoteric readings unless we have good reason to be making them. Where do you see him showing his true colors then that allows you to be making that reading of 351?
So I think it's a couple of things. So I mean, first of all, like, you saw my more recent article, which is not about mysticism per se, but just about philosophy, and I think the way I read the Meister Merkava chapters, I think that seems to me the point that he is making there, is pushing away from the Aristotelian metaphysics, and I think he repeatedly says throughout the guide that like explaining Meister Merkava is his point of writing the guide, and I think therefore how you interpret those chapters is key, and I think one of the
Meister Merkava is the Ezekiel's vision of the chariot. Maimonides goes through it. Okay, we've been very good at not using Hebrew terminology up until this point.
Yes. I think also one of the eye-opening things for me when I read the guide cover to cover is the astronomy chapters, which everyone just sort of skips when you're not reading it cover to cover, because like who cares what Maimonides thought about medieval astronomical theories.
Right.
But I think after having read it, I'm convinced the main reason he includes all these extensive discussions of astronomy is just to show you his skepticism with Aristotle.
Okay, so here's my question then, if I can jump in.
Yeah.
My question is, so I hear what you're saying. You're saying that Maimonides frames the guide as an attempt to explain what's happening, what's really happening in the sort of ancient Jewish esoteric traditions of Ezekiel's chariot, or the divine chariot rather. And whereas most interpreters see Maimonides as, and this is like a classic reading, as presenting an Orthodox Façade, although that term obviously doesn't exist, but really believing in an Aristotelian metaphysic, what you're saying is that he's presenting a Orthodox philosophical facade, namely Aristotelianism, which behind it is really resting his Neoplatonism, or more Neoplatonism. Again, I hesitate to use Neoplatonism because he is certainly not buying wholesale into Plotinus' system, but the negative theology, the rejection of the idea of God as intellect. Okay.
The rejection of, and again, this is, as Pina already pointed out, the rejection of separate intellects.
Yeah. Okay. So my question then is, let's take that. Let's take that as a premise, and that he really is reached himself a break with Aristotelianism, which must have been very tough for him, because I mean he's an Aristotelian from the age of 15. And he seems to only speak of him of the highest glowing terms until his dying day, and there may be some elements of of obfuscation there in his language, whatnot, but at least on the facade he's holding it. and instead he's embracing this really deep and radical negative theology, which just does shambles to his philosophy and presumably his religious theology as it was up until that point. Although it may be like, perhaps I'd be curious to hear your speculations if that brings him back to some sort of classic Talmudic or biblical Judaism in some sense. But here's my question. So let's take that. Let's assume that's the case. Do you see him ever making the case explicitly that you're wanting to make, that Maimonides, as a mystic, let's say, believes that the human can experience that God, the God of absolute negation, the apophatic God? Is he ever making that case, or are you needing to put those puzzle pieces together and say?
I think you have. I mean, yes, they're a puzzle. The guide is always a puzzle.
Sure.
But I think and here's where I guess Hadot's work was key for me, is if you really want to understand someone, the metaphysics of an ancient philosopher, you have to look at what their spiritual exercises are.
Right.
And in the Mishnah Torah, when he's talking about meditation, when in like, let's say, chapter 2 of Yesodei HaTorah, it's always meditating on God's wisdom. He always, and which, sort of in the Aristotelian sense, God and God's wisdom are one.
Right.
So if you're meditating on God's wisdom, you're meditating on God. But and it's sort of, but it becomes this, if you push that to the limit of mystical, if you push that to the mystical limit, that becomes union with God's wisdom, which ultimately is union with God in the Aristotelian sense.
Right.
When he's describing the spiritual exercises described in Guide 351 are different. When he describes, what are you doing with, when you say Kriya Shema, first focus on, removing everything, everything from your mind but that, but the word you're saying, and first do it with just the first pasuk and the first paragraph and the whole thing, and ultimately the whole thing. Then do it with the brachot, do it with Shemona Esrei, and you're sort of gradually expanding. But those are all practice meditations, right? That's not meditating on God's wisdom. That's just practicing. He's just using it as, as practice to focus your mind. It says, and ultimately, right? And ultimately, once you develop this mental focus, then you want to be at the point, where you can focus exclusively on God. But those aren't meditations on God per se. And I think that's hinting at the fact that you can't, in his final analysis in the guide, you can't meditate directly on God. God is just what you experience when you have the mental focus to be able to remove all other concepts. And you have to put the pieces together. Yeah, you have to take 351 and put it together with what he said about negative theology in the first part of the guide. But he never has you meditating on the Chokhmah the way he does in the Mishnah Torah. You're using various spiritual practices as practice meditations to train your mind, but the goal ultimately is not to meditate on God, but to experience God through removing everything else from your mind.
I'm trying to like open my mind to this argument, to give it its full justice. So you're saying because the meditation practice, which should be a focus on Hadot's suggestion, is not on God's wisdom, but is simply on an absence. That's precisely because we can't meditate upon God. It's bringing to mind I was actually just trying to find it here. Earlier in the guide, in 160 something, maybe it's 169. Can't remember. Where Maimonides writes about negative theology, he writes that no one can come to any sort of, no human mind can attain any sort of affirmative conception of God. Only God's self can know God in the positive, and that knowledge is, or the knowledge of God is that God cannot be known, right? And this is translated differently. This is translated differently by Pines and by Friedlander, where Friedlander translates it as the human knowledge of God is that God cannot be known, and Pines seems to keep it open, where it's like, where you could be reading it. It's hasagato. It's like in the Hebrew at least, which could be either referring to the human or the divine, which Wolfson is reading as that the divine self-knowledge, even God's knowledge of God, is simply that God cannot be known.
Right, and I think that's clearly reading it in the Platonian direction, whereas Friedlander may be reading it in the more Aristotelian direction, which is, and again, is consistent with the Mishnah Torah, which is, where the most you ever see in terms of negative theology in the Mishnah Torah is we cannot fully grasp what the ultimate reality of God, but it's a statement about us. It's not a statement about God.
Right.
And in various earlier writings, he does seem to suggest that this is a limitation of matter, but perhaps the post-mortem human intellect perhaps can understand more of the divine, as opposed to when you get to like you said, guide 169, where again you can raise the same question about the guide, and people do, but I think the simplest way to read it is actually a statement about God. Not, to the extent that we can make statements about God, the problem with it. But that, that God is the one who is beyond knowledge, not that there's a limitation of our intellects, we can't understand it.
Right. So that's an interesting parallel. And it's interesting to be reading those in concert with each other. I'm still feel like I'm missing the full weight of the argument, because let's say Maimonides is saying in 351 to meditate on nothingness, and it seems to be in that passage where he's talking about the Shema that he kind of, his language is a bit all over the place, right? Sometimes he's saying meditate on God, sometimes on the word itself, and sometimes it's like just clear your mind. It does seem that he plays around with language, and it's pretty clear that he's doing that intentionally. There's some sort of trying to throw the reader off in some regard there. But tell me if I'm portraying this correctly. If Maimonides is telling us to meditate upon nothingness because God's wisdom is not something that will bring us to God, right? Because we're post-Aristotelian at this point. And then you're saying then when at the end of the chapter he does describe some sort of unio mystica, we need to be reading that in light of the meditation upon nothingness and not the meditation through the intellect. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I mean, again, he just in some sense, I wish he'd, sort of come out and describe his journey directly, and, we wouldn't have to speculate and, piece together the puzzle. But I think that's part of the beauty of the guy, is he wanted to guide us along his journey.
Right.
He didn't just want to come out and tell us what he believes.
Right.
And yeah, and throughout the guide, he keeps throwing in this Aristotelian language, and but the way I see it, sort of still pointing to something beyond. Like he does this, like in the back in the chapter in part 1 of Negative Theology, where he talks about, well, how could you know about, how can one person know more about God than the other if all knowledge is negative? And he talks about, well, someone who knows that God doesn't have a body but thinks that God has emotions does not know God as well as someone who also knows that God doesn't have emotions. But then he has this etc. Right, that he's pointing to the and so on and so forth with each thing you negate. Well, I think if you within the Aristotelian framework, there's no need for an etc. Once you've gotten to God isn't a body and God isn't emotions, okay, what's left? Right, God is intellect. That's all you need to know.
Right.
Sort of. I think with the etc. he's pointing to the fact that you have that last stage you need to come to is realization that God isn't intellect either.
Yeah.
And yet he doesn't want to come out and say it directly.
Yeah. There's two things here that are just like really that are so fascinating to me. One of them is, as you're saying, that the guide is guiding, right, the person through the journey, and in some ways it seems like Maimonides himself it's like autobiographical. It's like it's his own spiritual journey that doesn't necessarily seem to be entirely resolved, right? He's writing it as letters and they're going one by one.
Right. I mean, I think that's also sort of the question, what's the title of the guide? Friedlander called it Guide for the Perplexed.
Right.
It's called the Guide of the Perplexed.
Right.
Which I think, Friedlander's title is, I am this guide who has all of the answers. You are the perplexed. I will guide you along the way. Whereas Guide of the Perplexed sort of includes himself in the perplexed as well.
Yeah. It's actually funny because you see that translation dispute come up a few times, like in 351 as well, when Maimonides writes, like, and I cannot aspire to guide, or is it to guide or to be guided, right? There is that sense of like, is he including himself in it, and is he not? And it seems, I mean, it's clear to me that he has enough grasp of the Arabic to put those ambiguities into the text. Like, it's not just our problem trying to read this text from our angle. And he says like, in as much in his introduction, that he's going to be doing these things to us. And in that sense, I mean, he's in the good tradition of Socrates and Plato, who are not like telling the student what they should believe, but they're leading them through their own process of trying to come to the truth. There's this anagoge, I think is the Greek term, where it's like where you lead first through this like Socratic method, but then through really like a spiritual method of like provoking students to their own, where learning is just remembering. In some sense, that's happening. I think one of the saddest things of the guide is the letters that Maimonides gets back from the student that he writes them to, and the student is like not impressed with the guide at all. Wow, that must have burnt so bad to get those. That whole game that they start the metaphors of the wayward woman, and that must have really stung. Like, so that's one element. Is this personal journey, the guide of the perplexed, where Maimonides is including himself in that. And that's one really phenomenal thing that always like gets me. The other is this realization, which I've said a few times here, which is that the great irony is that it's precisely the Neoplatonic God, which is where Maimonides' mysticism breaks. It's Maimonides' mysticism sits in his Aristotelian God, like, and that's both epistemologically and metaphysically, and that seems so funny to me, and I think that there's a good reason here to believe that like Maimonides' ultimate categorization, because he's so negative, puts him beyond like the categories of mystic or rationalist. Like, they just don't apply anymore, which is kind of the direction that my colleague Justin Sledge from Etcetera, I'm not sure if you saw his video, kind of the direction that he ends up going as well, which I think I might follow suit, which is so counterintuitive. I mean, because you're coming from the perspective of history of ideas. You're like, okay, these are the rationalist Aristotelians, like these are the schoolmen, and they're boring and non-mystical, or wherever the person's side, and these are the Neoplatonic mystics. This is your Ibn Gabirol and your Isaac Israeli and your Kabbalists, and then Maimonides inverts that, and we're left chasing this apophasis. We're left chasing this emptiness that doesn't really, for me, it's very hard to follow, because you're following him into the dark, right? You're following him into this blinding darkness. I'm curious firstly, if anything that I just said is interesting to respond to, feel free to. But I'm curious if, like you mentioned a few times that you're trying to do a phenomenological analysis of his religious philosophy. Where is that taking you? I'm curious to know. Like, give us the fresh.
Sort of a lot of the ideas I'm sharing with you now are sort of ideas that are still in their infancy in my head. And someday, God willing, I'll do more research and write it all up. So. any feedback or pushback is obviously welcome on them. Oh yeah, the in terms of the phenomenology, I think an important point I wanted to make is the guide doesn't end with 351, which
Correct.
is sort of like, right?
Correct.
The last 3 chapters of the guide just feel like tremendously anticlimactic once you've read 351.
Right.
Like, why didn't he end there?
Right.
And I think what he's getting at in the last few chapters of the guide is the mystical transformation of consciousness. And it's not just this momentary mystical experience of the divine, but you know, once you've had the direct mystical experience, it stays with you, and you know, your consciousness has this, you know, this constant awareness of the divine that stays with you thereafter, and you become this conduit of divine providence. And I think it's that shift in consciousness. I don't think he had the language to really describe that, but you know, now that, you know, with the work of, you know, starting with, you know, Huxley describes this, and then I saw you had an episode on him earlier on. I didn't listen to the episode yet, but Stace with the introverted versus extroverted mysticism. You know, where, you know, this, you know, I think you have, you know, with our examination of mysticism sort of around the world, we have the language to see exactly what's going on there in Maimonides, and it's this mystical shift in consciousness, where 351 he's describing the introverted mystical experience, and the last 3 chapters of the guide is about the extroverted mystical experience, where it stays with you. You have this constant divine witness with you in everything you do, guiding everything you do. And I think he alludes to that in the chapters on prophecy earlier as well, with the, you know, the prophet doesn't just have this momentary prophetic experience, but undergoes this sort of radical transformation in their personality. And I think there's, you know, I need to do more research, and you know, this is these ideas are not ready to be written up yet, but someday, God willing, hopefully I'll write them up, and just, you know, really analyzing again the phenomenology of Maimonides mysticism in the context of the general scholarship on mysticism, which I think scholars have avoided doing because nobody thinks of Maimonides as a mystic. And, you know,
Right.
Jewish mysticism is Kabbalah, and nobody thinks, hey, there are other Jews we could analyze through a mystical prism also.
Yeah. That's okay. That's really interesting. And you've kind of preempted where I'm hoping to end the series with, which is precisely where Maimonides ends the guide on, which is his Imitator Dei, where having had this realization of the Unio Mystica in 351, we now embody that, and we now live, and it's this mystical imitation of God in which we are agents of kindness and goodness and compassion and love. And it seems to be a clear result from 351. And the irony is that, like, when you're not reading Maimonides the way that we are, like, how you get from 351 to the end is a great question, right? And the second you change the perspective when you're reading him as, oh yeah, there's a mystical consciousness being engaged here, therefore the result is, and this is very standard in throughout mystical traditions, and definitely in Judaism as well, where it's like your mystical experience, which you theorize upon, leads you to change the way that you act and behave in the world. And that's the ethics of mysticism, which follows from the experience and theory, right? It's the practice of mysticism. And I mean, there's good reason, I think, to read like the prophets of ancient Israel as people who are having encounters with the divine, right? That's what a prophetic experience seems to be, at least. And their message is an ethical one. Their message is the same message that Maimonides concludes the guide on in many senses, which is interesting, because he doesn't end with silence. He ends with action, which in some ways brings him back to the Mishnah Torah as well, where he seems to be informed by that same ethic. At least there's been some scholarship trying to make that case. It's funny because, I mean, trying to plan out the series, there's an element of like the scholarship and the rigor, and there's also the element of like the presentability and like the narrative and entertainment value and like what story you're weaving. And I was from the very beginning, I'm thinking like, how am I going to end the series? Like what's the end note? And I always was thinking that I'm going to end with 351 and end on the note of Maimonides' silence and just end off in like literally into that silence. And then, but that's not where he ends. He comes back to that action, and I think that's a really beautiful notion. And in some ways, it brings him back into reality. It brings him back into the ethical demands of everyday life.
Faur talks about this also, where he goes back to Maimonides' description of Jacob's ladder, of the ladder is, the way Maimonides describes this, the ladder of the prophet. And, you have to go up the ladder towards your mystical experience, but then the prophet has to come down the ladder and re-enter the world.
Right. Yeah, it's the Campbellian return back to the hometown.
Right. Or, Plato's philosopher going back into the cave.
Right. Which doesn't end so well. That's really great. It was really great to connect. It was really great to meet you. It's been great reading your early scholarship. It definitely set me on the right path. So I'm appreciative of that. I have like this one final question, which is like a sour question. It's like, who then is the real Maimonides? There's this whole thing. It's like, is it Maimonides of the Mishnah Torah or is it the Maimonides of the Gemara? In your hot take, who is the real Maimonides?
At what point in his life?
Good answer.
I don't think he was being insincere in the Mishnah Torah. I think at each stage in his life it represents where he was in his own thinking at that time.
And where does he come by the end of the journey?
By the end of the journey, I think he has lost faith in Aristotelian metaphysics. But I think the one thing that is consistent really from sort of beginning to end is his interest in prophecy. Again, not just meaning the words of the Bible, but meaning trying to achieve prophecy as an individual goal. Whether he believed he ever actually achieved it, I don't know. But I think over the course of his life, the metaphysical background to what he thought was necessary to achieve it changed. But I think the one constant throughout his life is the pursuit of prophecy.
Yeah, it's a very I did hear something beautiful which kind of connects up these two books, which is that Maimonides, in some sense, and this may not be said in a technical sense because Maimonides deals with the issue of prophecy and halacha in a technical sense, but the audacity to write a text like Mishnah Torah takes the meaning of from Moses to Moses, none arose like Moses, where you really do, like Maimonides needs to believe in some sense that he has some sort of prophetic access to the true Torah, which he then writes down in the Mishnah Torah. And he says, you need no other book besides for this and the written Torah. And in that statement, that seems to be some sort of culmination of his like halachic or like his halachic formulation from this prophetic state in some absurd, like grandiose way.
Yeah, I mean, I think the more I delve into Maimonides, like from Moses to Moses, none arose like Moses. I think it's true. I mean, I know, like people say it's a hyperbole, but like he really did, I think, reveal truths about spirituality, the nature of God, to the extent that you can say anything about the nature of God, in ways that really no one since Moses did, and no one since him has really done either. And I think that's why so much of post-Maimonidean Jewish theology is just trying to uncover the meaning of Maimonides, because it really was just such a profound work.
Right, a revelation, you could say. Well, David, from David to David, none was like David. It's been a pleasure, and looking forward to staying in touch. Glad to connect.
Yes, I hope we can stay in touch. This really has been a pleasure, having someone to talk about Maimonides with in this, on this level, in this vein. So yeah, this has been a pleasure. We should definitely keep in touch.
Yes, looking forward to your future work once those things get formulated, once you've and settled down, and looking forward to hearing your feedback on whether I do justice or not to the matter of.
And if you ever decide to write anything in traditional scholarship, I look forward to reading that as well.
Very cool. Thanks for joining me. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Take care.
Thank you.